Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. The Department of Education is asking for an increase in its budget, in part to increase funding for its Office of Civil Rights. Joining me today is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, why is Education Secretary Miguel Cardona arguing they need this extra funding?
So in a House Appropriations Committee hearing, Secretary Miguel Cardona said that the government should pay for more money to go toward the Office of Civil Rights, which is the, if you're not familiar with it, it's the Department of Education's sort of like civil enforcement arm. So it's like they are the ones who do investigations of like schools and colleges, and they uphold the, it's called the Title IX like federal funding statute. And so like that applies to, anti-discrimination based on protected characteristics. So a lot of the Title IX that's being invoked and talked about now is sort of that transgender athlete rule change proposal. So that's something that is forthcoming. And during that hearing, Cardona was pressed multiple times by different Republican lawmakers about the state of that. And all he would say is that, we're still working on it. So in case you were curious about that, that's kind of what that is too, is that, they're still going through all the comments and that's still forthcoming. But essentially, then the Office of Civil Rights is able to investigate those complaints and also is accountable for investigating complaints about, alleged discrimination. And so looking into those situations and trying to find out, okay, what happened here? Did it break the law? And if it did, how do we remediate that? And so they'll go into agreements with different school districts, right? And say, somebody alleged this is what we found, and this is sort of the plan that you need to be on. You need to take a survey, and you need to make sure that the reporting is better for the Title IX. And they have different steps that they can do. And usually these school districts will enter into an agreement of cooperation with the Office of Civil Rights. And so that's an interesting aspect, but they're basically asking for $22 million more for that, which in an $82.4 billion budget is kind of like a drop in the bucket, right? But, it does, these kinds of things add up, and it is federal taxpayer money. And they're saying basically its workload has tripled in the last decade and a half, in part due to rising rates of antisemitism and anti-Arab discrimination. And as you are aware, tensions in the Middle East are high, and there's been a spike in those different kinds of anti-Semitism, anti-Arab discrimination. Previously, too, the Department of Education confirmed, a spokesperson confirmed that the large majority of those complaints are anti-Semitic incidents. So, in recent months, that's been what they've seen. They couldn't get into too many specifics, so they didn't release that. Basically said, there's a much smaller proportion of complaints about Islamophobia or anti-Arab sentiment, alleged complaints there. So these would be investigated and looked into. So essentially, too, the Office of Civil Rights will also send out guidance and say this is what your legal obligations to students are, and they do that for based on shared ancestry or religion. So basically that same kind of thing of here's what to do to protect Jewish students, or here's what to do to protect Islamic students and that kind of thing. But they've also said, and this is, an interesting point that Chalkboard has reported in the last year or so, is that they're willing to go after school districts that are looking into content moderation for books. So if they're willing to remove books from shelves, which critics call book bans, right? And then proponents of that say, we're not banning books. You can still go buy them at Barnes & Noble, for example. We just don't want them paid for with federal funds or local funds to be available for students in our school library because it's pornographic or explicit material. And so basically the Office of Civil Rights Assistant Secretary Catherine Lamont said she was eager to pull federal funds from schools that create a hostile environment because of these book removals. So essentially, if you are a school district and you remove these books over parental concerns, we'll yank your funding. Well, you will pull your federal funds because you're getting, maybe you're a Title I school or you have these different programs that are federally sponsored, then that's at risk, right? So why would a school district remove federal funds then, or remove these books then if it would threaten their federal funds? So it's sort of I think if you have a perspective of even local control or sort of federalism, like that could raise questions about that. But on the other side, these proponents are saying, okay, like we should protect these LGBTQI plus youth, these different sexual minority youth, and we should allow them access to resources that affirm their identity or, provide them with like characters that they can relate to. And so I think that's some of the, the pushback on that is that, if schools are not doing that, then they are creating a hostile environment. One side note here, the Office of Civil Rights, they targeted a Georgia school district for basically, from what I could tell when I wrote this last year, it was basically comments that were made at a board meeting. So they like went to the public board meeting and they said that students felt threatened, but I don't think they heard from anybody directly that like, okay, like we're reporting this. It was just that there was like that the comments during the school board meeting conveyed the impression that books were being screened to exclude diverse authors and characters. But I think in terms of like what they were actually doing or what the actual criticisms were, is often directed at like sexual explicit material. And I think that sometimes complicates things because some of these books with LGBTQ plus characters also has some of that sexual content in it. That's sort of the crux of a lot of these debates is like, is it too far or does it affirm these sexual minority youth? And so that's something that's going to keep going on. But essentially, that's an interesting thing is that this would add to that sort of enforcement mechanism. It seems like they'd be able to hire more people. They'd be able to look into more of these kinds of things. And it might not be that they pursue that route as aggressively, but it seems like they're very willing and ready to do that. And even hired, or there was even the nomination of the so-called book ban czar last year. So it does seem like from what we've seen in the last year or so, and then also with this ask for more federal funding, that this could become like more of an enforcement mechanism over some of these content moderation debates. So I just think that that's a very interesting thing. A lot of people are not reporting that, but we've been trying to follow that thread at Chalkboard News.
And did Secretary Cardona mention that side of things at all when he was talking, or did he just focus primarily on the reports of anti-Semitism?
He did. He was asked by a Democratic lawmaker, Lois Frankel, about what the department was doing to promote inclusive material. And he said, the number of titles targeted for censorship in public libraries increased by 92% over the last year. I mean, I'm directly quoting him. In school libraries, it increased 11%, and 47% of those titles are books about LGBTQI or BIPOC individuals. And that means Black, Indigenous, people of color, for people who are maybe not familiar with that term. So that shares the perspective of which books are being targeted. So again, like that was Secretary Cardona talking, and there specifically for him in the Biden administration, the content moderation debates that are happening in school districts, those are against these books that are about LGBTQI characters or BIPOC individuals. And so they're seeing it as like these are an attack on the oppressed, and we need to do everything we can to stop that. But the critics of these books are saying, look, there are explicit sex scenes. And we've written about that a little bit at Chalkboard News. And, I think it's enough to make people blush, right? And we don't have to get into specifics here. But I mean, if you can go and find those kinds of books on different rating websites that have looked at them and broken down, like here maybe are the controversial parts of it. And so then you're arguing about, does this have educational value? And that's sort of a different question than maybe what the Biden administration is arguing, is that, it makes it look like these are like targeting these books just because they were written by people of color or because they were written by sexual minority authors. And I think that that's, maybe a little bit outside of like what the people who are trying to remove them would say. So I think that there's a little bit of that, political gamesmanship happening. But essentially, he said that the Office of Civil Rights will continue to support the public and the school communities in understanding their rights. And he said that we do feel that we need to have materials and supports available, right? So I think that this is a vested interest that the Department of Education has, and specifically the Office of Civil Rights, in making sure that these sexual minority youth have these books available, kind of whatever the cost.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Attention parents, teachers, and taxpayers. Do you care about the decisions being made in K-12 public education? Do you want to know how those decisions impact your students and school district? Chalkboard News has you covered. We're delivering fact-based reporting on the policies that shape school safety, curriculum, and recovery from learning loss. At Chalkboard News, we're cutting through the politics and focusing on the facts behind the issues impacting students, teachers, and families. Get this news delivered to your inbox for free by signing up at chalkboardnews.com.